Deontological Ethics, MPCR 5000, written and presented by Professor Scott D. Applegate, Georgetown University. Last week we looked at the consequentialist family of ethical theories. Consequentialist ethics, also known as utilitarian or teleological ethics, are a family of ethics that determines the morality of an action solely by its outcome. An act is right if and only if it maximizes pleasure or benefits, or minimizes pain or negative consequences. This week, we are looking at our second family of ethical theories known as deontological or non-consequentialist ethics. Before we dive into the technical details of deontological theory, I want to emphasize something John Locke articulated beautifully. Reading furnishes the mind only with materials of knowledge. It is thinking that makes what we read ours. This quote is particularly relevant to our course expectations on reading around the subject. In graduate level ethics education, we're not simply transmitting information for you to memorize. The goal is for you to engage deeply with these ethical frameworks, to wrestle with them, critique them, and ultimately internalize them in ways that shape your professional judgment. As we explore deontology today, I encourage you to actively think about how these principles apply to your work in cybersecurity. Question them. Test them against scenarios you've encountered or anticipate encountering. This critical engagement, this reading around the subject, is what transforms passive reception of information into genuine understanding. When I ask you to read around the subject in this course, I'm asking you to do exactly what Locke describes. Take the materials we provide and make them yours through active thinking, exploration, and application. What are deontological or non-consequentialist ethics? Deontology is a family of ethics that focuses on the relationship between duty and the morality of human action. In deontological ethics, an action is considered morally right because of some characteristic of the action itself, not because it produces a good outcome. And in fact, deontological ethics would consider some acts to be morally obligatory or morally prohibited regardless of their consequences for human welfare. Recall that there are no morally prohibited actions under a consequentialist framework. This is not true for deontology, under which some actions would be morally obligatory or morally prohibited. Deontologists would hold that you cannot achieve a good result through evil means. Within the domain of moral theories that assess our choices, deontologists stand in opposition to consequentialists who believe that the ends justify the means. Expressions you might attribute to deontologists include duty for duty's sake, or let justice be done though the heavens may fall. Origins of deontology. The first great philosopher to define deontological principles was Immanuel Kant. Born in 1724 to Johann Georg Kant, a harness maker, and Anna Regina Reuter, Kant is said to have lived a very strict and disciplined life. He never married, had an active social life, and was a popular and successful teacher before starting his major philosophical works. He was an influential Prussian-German philosopher in the Age of Enlightenment. Kant's doctrine of transcendental idealism argued that space, time, and causation are mere sensibilities. Things in themselves exist, but their nature is unknowable. In his view, the mind shapes and structures experience, and reason is the source of all morality. Kant was an idealist who believed that perpetual peace could be secured through universal democracy and international cooperation. He published works on ethics, religion, law, aesthetics, astronomy, and history. Kant did not so much attempt to define a list of obligatory duties as he provided a procedure, the categorical imperative, for determining what should be duties. Morality is not the doctrine of how we may make ourselves happy, but how we may make ourselves worthy of happiness. Immanuel Kant. What are deontological ethics? The concept of motive is especially important in deontology. Kant once said, "The only absolutely good thing is goodwill," and so the single determining factor of whether an act is morally right is the will or motive of the person doing it. This is an oversimplification of deontology and ignores the central concept of deontology, the categorical imperative, but motive is still quite important. Two people can conduct the same identical act, and yet one may do so for moral reasons, while the other may be considered immoral. Imagine you are on the street with a date and pass a homeless person. You decide to give the person some spare change in hopes of improving his or her life. In this case, your motive is good, and thus the act is good. If, however, you conduct the same act, but your motivation is only to impress the person you are with your generosity and benevolence, rather than actually having concern for the welfare of the homeless person you just gave money to, then this same act would be considered immoral, as you are not acting from goodwill. In these two acts, the outcome is the same, the act is the same, but the will or motive for doing the act determines its overall morality. Central concepts of deontology. Kant opposed utilitarianism. He believed that certain types of actions, including murder, theft, and lying, were completely prohibited, even if the outcomes would provide the most happiness for the greatest number of people. He made a clear distinction between two imperatives, the hypothetical imperative and the categorical imperative. Hypothetical imperative. These are not moral commands, as they do not apply to everyone. They command conditionally and are only followed if one wants to achieve a certain goal. Hypothetical imperatives all include the word if. For example, if you want to get a good job, you have to study hard. Kant says we should never follow the hypothetical imperative. Categorical imperatives are moral commands, and they command unconditionally. They tell everyone what to do and are not dependent on personal desire of goals. Kant said we should always follow the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is the central philosophical concept in deontological ethics and is a method of evaluating the motivations for actions. Let me say that again. The categorical imperative is the central philosophical concept in deontological ethics. If you are trying to evaluate something from a deontological perspective and you are not using the categorical imperative, then you are not evaluating it from a classical deontological perspective. Kant laid out the categorical imperative in three formulations. Here are Kant's three formulations of the categorical imperative. Let's examine each one carefully because understanding these formulations is essential to applying deontological ethics in practice. The first formulation, sometimes called the formula of universal law, states, act only according to that maxim by which you can also will that it would become a universal law. In other words, before you act, ask yourself, what if everyone did this? If universal adoption of your principle would be self-defeating or create a world you couldn't rationally accept, then the action is morally wrong. For example, you can't universalize lying because if everyone lied, the practice of truthful communication would break down, making lying itself impossible. The second formulation, the formula of humanity, states, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. This means respecting the inherent dignity and autonomy of all persons. You can't treat people merely as tools to achieve your objectives, even good objectives. In cybersecurity, this has profound implications. It means user privacy and consent matter intrinsically, not just instrumentally. The third formulation, the formula of the kingdom of ends, states, every rational being must so act as if he were, through his maxim, always a legislating member in a universal kingdom of ends. This asks us to act as if we were creating moral laws for an ideal community of rational beings who treat each other with mutual respect. It emphasizes the idea that moral principles must be acceptable from everyone's perspective. The first formulation is about universalization of a maxim, meaning that the action must be good enough to be universally adopted by all rational beings. The third formulation is about acting as if your maxims of action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. This formulation emphasizes the idea that action should be based on principles that a community of rational agents could accept. The difference is subtle and lies in the focus of the first formulation on universalization and the third formulation on the role of lawgivers in a universal kingdom of ends. Using reasoned judgment, we can apply this formula to any maxim and discover if it's morally permissible under deontological ethics. Take, for example, the simple act of picking flowers in a local park. The flowers are very pretty, and one may want to take some home. Essentially, this requires adopting a maxim that supports doing whatever you want to do. Using the formula of universal law, the categorical imperative, there are a few irrationalities and contradictions that arise from the adoption of such a maxim as law. If everyone were to do this, there would be no flowers left in the park, and the act contradicts the original motive for picking flowers. The better option is to go to a shop and order or plant one's own flowers. Now I want to address an excellent question that often arises when studying Kant. How do goodwill and the categorical imperative fit together? They might seem contradictory. Kant says goodwill is the only absolutely good thing, and that the categorical imperative determines if an action is right. So which is it? The answer is they work together as two essential components of moral action. Think of them as answering different questions. The categorical imperative answers the objective question, what actions are morally right or wrong? It gives us a test. Can I universalize this maxim? Am I treating humanity as an end in and of itself? The categorical imperative identifies our duties. It's the objective standards that tells us what we ought to do. Goodwill, on the other hand, answers the subjective question. What makes me morally praiseworthy for doing an action? It requires that I act from duty, because I recognize it is my duty, not just that I happen to conform to duty for other reasons like self-interest or fear. Here is the formula. A right action as determined by the categorical imperative, done with the right motive, goodwill, produces genuine moral worth. You need both components. The categorical imperative without goodwill gives you mere conformity, doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. Goodwill without the categorical imperative gives you sincere but potentially misguided actions, wanting to do the good but not knowing what good actually requires. Let's look at a concrete example and see how this plays out. Kant gives us a famous example that perfectly illustrates this distinction, the honest shopkeeper. This example shows why both the categorical imperative and goodwill are necessary. Imagine two shopkeepers, both of whom charge fair prices and don't cheat their customers. From the outside, their behavior is identical, but their motives are completely different. Shopkeeper A doesn't cheat customers because it would be bad for business. If word got out that he was dishonest, he'd lose customers and damage his reputation. He's doing the right thing, but purely from self-interest. He's acting in accordance with duty, but not from duty. According to Kant, this action has no moral worth. It's the right action, but done for the wrong reasons. Shopkeeper B doesn't cheat customers because he recognizes a duty to treat them fairly, to respect them as ends in themselves rather than mere means to his profit. He would act honestly even if he could get away with cheating, even if it cost him financially. He's acting from duty, from goodwill. This action has moral worth. Same external behavior, but morally praiseworthy because of the motive. This is why Kant says goodwill is the only unconditional good thing. Intelligence, skills, even right actions can be deployed for bad purposes or done for bad reasons. Only goodwill, the commitment to act from duty, is unconditionally good. For you as future cybersecurity professionals, this distinction matters. It's not enough to simply comply with security protocols and codes of ethics or legal requirements. The goal is to internalize these as genuine duties, to develop the kind of character where you do the right thing because you recognize it as right, not just because someone is watching or because you fear the consequences. That's the difference between being technically compliant and being genuinely ethical. Both the categorical imperative and goodwill are necessary for the latter. This quote by Immanuel Kant provides a more accessible formulation of the first categorical imperative. So act that your principle of action might safely be made a law for the whole world. This is the universability test in its simplest form. Before you act, ask yourself, what if everyone operated according to this principle? Would that create a world you could rationally endorse? Let's apply this to a cybersecurity scenario. Suppose you discover a zero-day vulnerability in widely deployed software. You're considering whether to sell the vulnerability information to a broker on the gray market, reasoning that you deserve compensation for your work and someone else will find and exploit it anyway. Apply the universability test. What if every security researcher operated on this principle? What if the universal practice was to sell vulnerabilities to the highest bidder rather than reporting them to vendors? You'd likely conclude that such a system would result in vulnerabilities being weaponized rather than patched, leaving users vulnerable to exploitation indefinitely. This undermines the security ecosystem you're a part of. Alternately, consider a different scenario. You're considering accessing production systems beyond your authorized scope to investigate a suspected breach, reasoning that finding the threat quickly justifies the boundary violation. Apply the universability test. What if every security professional felt entitled to exceed their authorized access whenever they believed they had good reasons? The result would be erosion of access controls, privilege creep, and ultimately less security, not more. The universability test is a powerful tool because it forces us to think beyond our immediate situation and consider broader implications of our actions. It's a check against special pleading and rationalizing exceptions for ourselves that we wouldn't accept for others. When you find yourself thinking this situation is different or I have good reasons, the universability test asks, are your reasons actually universal principles or are you just making excuses? Forms of deontological ethics. There are three major forms of Kantian deontological ethics. Those are agent-centered deontological theories, which includes divine command theory, patient-centered deontological theories, and contractarian deontological theories. W.D. Ross also created a modern form of deontology called pluralistic deontology. We will explore each of these in the next few slides. Agent-centered deontological theories. Most deontological ethical theories are divided into agent-centered and patient-centered frameworks. Agent-centered deontologists focus on keeping one's moral record spotless no matter what the cost and deal mostly with the actions that one performs. According to agent-centered theories, we have permissions, allowances to take certain actions, and obligations, requirements to take or abstain from certain actions. An agent relative reason is so called because it is a reason relative to the moral agent, i.e. the person, whose reason it is. It need not, although it may, constitute a reason for anyone else to take action. In other words, if I am the agent, the reason for conducting the action is relative to or important to me and may not necessarily be important to anyone else. This concept of agency does not give us permission to engage in an immoral act. It simply gives us permission to prioritize one moral course of action over another moral course of action because we have agency for the former, as it is important to us in some way. Agent-centered deontological theories. What is agency? Agency is, in essence, permission to focus on those things that are related to us, even at the exclusion of things like broader societal needs. We are obligated to keep our own house in order. We are not our brother's keeper, and it is not necessarily our duty to ensure our neighbor keeps his or her house in order. We must focus on keeping our own moral character free of taint. Agent-centered deontological theories. Thus, an agent-relative obligation is an obligation for a particular agent to take or refrain from taking some action, and because it is agent-relative, the obligation does not necessarily give anyone else a reason to support that action. Each parent, for example, is commonly thought to have such special obligations to his or her child, obligations not shared by anyone else. Likewise, an agent-relative permission is a permission for some agent to do some act even though others may not be permitted to aid that agent in doing of his or her permitted act. Each parent, to revert to the same example, is commonly thought to be permitted, at the least, to save his or her own child, even at the cost of not saving two other children to whom he or she has no special relation. Agent-centered theories and the agent-relative reasons on which they are based not only enjoin each of us to do or not do certain things, they also instruct me to treat my friends, my family, my promises in certain ways because they are mine, even if by neglecting them I could do more for others' friends, families, or promises. Divine command theory. Divine command theory is an example of an agent-centered deontological theory. In divine command theory, an action is right if and only if God has decreed it so, and an action is obligatory if God has commanded it. If God commands that you kill your child, then that is an obligatory duty under divine command theory. Divine command theory. As it does in all deontological theories, intent matters in divine command theory. It is most commonly asserted that it is our intended ends and intended means that most crucially define our agency. Such intentions mark out what it is we set out to achieve through our actions. If we intend something bad as an end, or even as a means to some more benevolent end, we are said to have set ourselves at evil, something we are categorically forbidden to do under deontological frameworks. If God commands people not to work on the Sabbath, then people act rightly if they do not work on the Sabbath, but solely because God has commanded it. If they do not work on the Sabbath because they are lazy, then their action is not truly right, even though the physical action performed is the same. In other words, the difference in between two identical actions are right or wrong can come down to the intent of the individual performing these actions. Now we turn to patient-centered deontological theories, which represent the libertarian branch of deontology. While agent-centered theories focus on the duties of the person acting, patient-centered theories focus on upholding one's rights and respecting the rights of others. The central concern here is the rights of the patient, not in the medical sense, but meaning the person who is acted upon, the recipient of someone else's action. Patient-centered theories emphasize our rights against being used only as a means for producing good consequences without our consent. It is a right against being used by another for the user's or other's benefit. More specifically, patient-centered deontology prescribes the using of another's body, labor, talent without the latter's consent. This connects directly to Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative that we discussed earlier. Always treat humanity as an end in itself, never merely as a means. Patient-centered deontology puts this principle at the forefront, arguing that respecting individual rights is the primary moral requirement. To contrast agent-centered theories with patient-centered theories, in agent-centered theories, a decision to act will be conditional on whether such an act is a moral duty and whether the act would stain the moral agent's character. In patient-centered theories, the act would be conditioned upon whether the moral agent was upholding their own rights and whether they were treading on someone else's rights. In cybersecurity, this has profound implications. It means that even if monitoring everyone's communications would make us significantly safer, doing so without consent violates people's rights in a way that can't be justified by appealing to beneficial outcomes. Users have rights to privacy, to control over their own data, to informed consent, and these rights constrain what we may do to them, even in the name of security. This quote from Ayn Rand captures the essence of patient-centered deontology. The end does not justify the means. No one's rights can be secured by the violation of the rights of others. Rand was a strong advocate of individual rights and a critic of collectivist ethics. While her broader philosophical system, objectivism, differs from Kantian deontology in significant ways, this particular principle aligns closely with patient-centered deontological thinking. The principle is straightforward but has far-reaching implications. You cannot justifiably violate someone's rights in order to protect someone else's rights, or even to protect the rights of many others. Each person has inherent moral standing that cannot be overridden by consequentialist calculations. One person's rights don't disappear just because violating them would benefit others. Somewhat orthogonal to the distinction between agent-centered versus patient-centered deontological theories are contractarian deontological theories. Contractarian deontological theories stem from the political philosophy of the social contract, developed by thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Locke. While these philosophers were primarily concerned with political legitimacy, explaining why we're obligated to obey the state, Their ideas have been adopted to ground moral obligations as well. The core idea is that moral norms derive their normative force from the idea of contract or mutual agreement. In this view, moral acts are those we would all agree to if we were unbiased, if we didn't know our particular position in society or our specific interests. This connects to John Rawls' famous veil of ignorance thought experiment in modern political philosophy. This approach treats moral rules themselves as a sort of contract. Just as we're bound by explicit contracts we've agreed to, we're bound by moral rules that represent a kind of implicit agreement among rational persons about how to structure our interactions. We agree to be bound by certain rules because we recognize that everyone benefits when we all follow them. An important implication: only people who understand and agree to the terms of the contract are bound by it. This has interesting applications to questions about moral obligations to beings who cannot participate in such agreements: young children, future generations, animals, or potentially artificial intelligences. In cybersecurity, contractarian thinking appears in concepts like acceptable use policies, terms of service, and professional codes of ethics. These are literal contracts or quasi-contracts that create genuine moral obligations for those who agree to them. But contractarianism also provides a framework for thinking about what rules we should adopt. What norms would rational, self-interested parties agree to if they were designing the rules for cyberspace from scratch, not knowing whether they be users, administrators, attackers, or defenders? So, what then is a social contract? It is an agreement whereby people give up some rights to a government or other authority in order to receive or jointly preserve social order. So, for example, we have freedom of speech as an enumerated right in our nation's preeminent social contract, the Constitution. But the right to free speech is not unlimited. We have placed restrictions on the right to maintain social order. You cannot use free speech as a means to incite violence. You can't shout fire in a crowded theater, as this would disrupt the social order. Pluralistic deontology was championed by philosopher W.D. Ross and is based on 7 prima facie duties which need to be taken into consideration when deciding which duty should be acted upon. Whether one duty trumps another is subjective to the moral agent, and there is no hierarchical ordering of these prima facie duties when they conflict with each other. Ross believed that there are a number of duties that reflection reveals, and these form a group of prima facie obligations. Prima facie, all things being equal, refers to the fact that these duties do not bind us absolutely, but that rather they generally hold, absent any further considerations. Prima facie is a law term for a case in which the evidence produced is sufficient to enable a decision or verdict to be made unless the evidence is refuted. These duties are as follows: the duty of beneficence, to help other people to increase their pleasure, improve their character, etc. The duty of non-malfeasance, to avoid harming other people. The duty of justice, to ensure people get what they deserve. The duty of self-improvement, to improve ourselves. The duty of reparation, to recompense someone if you have acted wrongly towards them. The duty of gratitude, to benefit people who have benefited us. The duty of promise keeping, to act according to explicit and implicit promises, including the implicit promise to tell the truth. Here's the key insight. There may be clashes or conflicts between these duties, and when they conflict, we must make a decision about which duty should trump another in that specific situation. Unlike strict Kantian deontology, Ross acknowledges that there are no hard and fast rules for how to resolve these conflicts, and no fixed order of significance among the duties. This approach is more realistic than strict versions of deontology because it acknowledges that moral life is complicated. We genuinely do have multiple duties, and sometimes they pull us in different directions. The duty to tell the truth might conflict with the duty not to harm someone. The duty of justice might conflict with the duty of gratitude. That an act is prima facie right is self-evident, just as a mathematical axiom is evident. W.D. Ross. Ross believed that our prima facie duties are self-evident to mature, thoughtful people. We don't need elaborate philosophical arguments to recognize that we have duties of beneficence, justice, promise-keeping, and so on. These duties are as obvious to our moral sense as basic mathematical truths are to our mathematical reasoning. This claim is intriguing. Ross is suggesting that when we carefully reflect on moral situations, certain duties just strike us as obvious. We don't need a philosophical system to tell us that keeping promises matters, that we should help others when we can, that we should make amends when we've done wrong. These insights are, in some sense, built into our moral understanding. However, and this is crucial, Ross is not claiming that what we should do overall in any given situation is self-evident. That requires careful judgment and weighing of competing prima facie duties. What's self-evident is that each of these duties has some claim on us. Figuring out which takes precedence in a particular case requires wisdom and experience. Let's take a step back and consider the advantages of deontological ethics as a framework for professional practice. First, deontological ethics allows agents to give special concern to their families, friends, and projects. Unlike pure utilitarianism, which might demand that you always maximize overall good even at great personal cost, deontology recognizes that special relationships create genuine obligations. This seems to match our moral intuitions better than purely impartial ethical theories. Second, deontology allows for supererogatory actions that go above and beyond what duty requires. A deontologist can do more that is morally praiseworthy than morality actually demands. You can be a moral hero by going above and beyond your duties, but you're not failing morally if you only fulfill your actual obligations. This seems more realistic than theories that demand you always do the most good possible. Third, deontological ethics is able to account for strong, widely shared moral intuitions about our duties. Most people have the intuition that there's something wrong with killing an innocent person even to save 5 others, or with violating someone's rights for a good outcome. Deontology explains and validates these intuitions rather than dismissing them as irrational. Fourth, deontology has a potential for explaining why certain people have moral standing to complain about and hold to account those who breach their moral duties. If I violate your rights, you specifically have been wronged. You have standing to object. This captures something important about interpersonal nature of morality that consequentialist theories can miss. For cybersecurity professionals, these advantages translate into a framework that respects your professional relationships, acknowledges that you can go above and beyond without being required to do so, validates your intuitions about rights and duties, and explains why stakeholders can hold you accountable when you fail in your duties to them. However, deontological ethics also face significant challenges and criticisms. It's important to grapple with these weaknesses honestly. First, there is the seeming irrationality of our having duties or permissions to make the world morally worse. If I have a duty not to lie, even when lying would prevent greater lies by others, aren't I letting the world become worse than it could be? Some find this hard to accept. It seems to prioritize moral purity over actual outcomes. Second, there are conflicts that exist between certain duties and between certain rights. What happens when the duty to tell the truth conflicts with the duty not to harm someone? What happens when one person's right to property conflicts with another person's right to life? Deontology doesn't always provide clear mechanisms for resolving these conflicts. Third, there's a potential for what some critics called avoision, using omissions, foresight, risk, allowings, aidings, and redirectings, and other subtle distinctions to achieve permissibility for what otherwise deontological morality would forbid. If I can't directly harm someone, but I can create conditions where they'll likely be harmed by others or by circumstances, am I really respecting deontological constraints, or am I just gaming the system? Fourth, there's the paradox of relative stringency, asserting that all deontological duties are categorical, to be done no matter the consequences, and yet asserting that some such duties are more stringent than others. How can this be? If they're all categorical, how can one trump another? Finally, there are situations where compliance with deontological norms will bring about disastrous consequences. Should we really follow our duties when doing so will lead to catastrophe? This is the problem of moral absolutism in its most challenging form. These are genuine difficulties, and honest engagement with them is part of developing a mature ethical perspective. In your careers, you'll likely encounter situations where these tensions become very real. This powerful quote from Thomas Hobbes reminds us the doctrine of right and wrong is perpetually disputed both by pen and the sword. Hobbes is acknowledging that ethical disputes aren't just academic debates, they're struggles that have real-world consequences. People fight over what's right and wrong, literally and figuratively. Ethics matters because it affects how we structure society, how we treat each other, and what we're willing to fight for or against. This quote is particularly apt as we transition to discussing deontological ethics in cyberspace because we're entering a domain where questions of right and wrong are very much being contested. There's no settled consensus on cybersecurity ethics. Different stakeholders have different views about privacy, security, responsibility, and rights. Some advocate for strong encryption as a fundamental right, while others argue it enables criminals and terrorists. Some believe in unrestricted information freedom, while others support content moderation and platform responsibility. Some think offensive cyber operations are legitimate tools of statecraft, while others see them as dangerous violations of sovereignty. These aren't just philosophical debates. They're being fought in courts, in legislative bodies, in international forums, and yes, sometimes with actual cyber weapons. The doctrine of right and wrong in cyberspace is very much disputed by the pen and the sword, and by policy papers and cyber attacks. As future cybersecurity professionals, you're entering this contested space. You'll need to develop your own ethical positions, defend them with clear reasoning, and be prepared to engage with those who disagree. The deontological framework we've been discussing gives you one powerful set of tools for this work, but it's ultimately up to you to decide how to apply them and when to invoke them. Now let's bring deontological ethics into the specific context of cyberspace and cybersecurity. How do these philosophical principles apply to our digital world? First, there are arguments about duties in cyberspace that assume cyberspace is not unique, that the same moral principles that apply in physical space apply online. On this view, lying is still wrong, even if it's in an email rather than face-to-face. Theft is still wrong, even if it's digital data rather than physical property. The median doesn't change the moral character of the action. Second, deontological thinking is particularly relevant to questions of attribution, trust, and deception in cyberspace. If we have a duty to be honest, does that create obligations about how we present ourselves online? If we have a duty to respect others' autonomy, what does that mean for how we design systems that track or influence behavior? If we have duties of transparency, how do we balance those against security needs for obscurity? Third, there's the fascinating question of robot ethics. Can machines think in a deontological manner despite lacking reflective capacity? Or can they only calculate outcomes in a utilitarian way? As we develop increasingly autonomous systems, including AI-powered security tools, we need to think carefully about whether and how we can encode deontological principles into these systems. Can an AI understand the categorical imperative? Can it respect rights? Can it act from duty rather than just being programmed to produce good outcomes? Finally, professional codes of ethics in cyberspace have strong deontological elements. Most professional codes of ethics in science and engineering consist of duties and rules. Does it follow that their authors tacitly accept deontological orientation and ethics? The primary difference between professional codes and deontological ethical theories is that some duties are directed towards the interests of the clients or the firms, but ultimately the performance of these duties supports that particular profession. The grounding of duties in professional codes resembles the function of rules under rule utilitarianism. These rules would not be morally required for the general public, as would the rules of deontological ethics. Professional codes are tools to improve the profession. The end of right action in this case is dependent upon the good of the profession, and the content of duties will depend on the particular view of the authors concerning that good. Understanding deontological ethics helps you understand why these codes matter and how to apply them thoughtfully in complex situations. Summary. Under a deontological framework, an action is considered morally good because of some characteristic of the action itself, not because it produces a good outcome. The categorical imperative is the central concept of deontological ethics. If you are making an argument under a classic Kantian deontological framework and you are not using the categorical imperative, then you are not really making a deontological argument. The three major types of Kantian deontological ethics are agent-centered deontology, to include divine command theory, patient-centered deontology, and contractarianism. W.D. Ross has also pioneered a more modern form of deontology that is an amalgam of deontology and virtue ethics called pluralistic deontology. I want to close with one of Kant's most beautiful and famous quotes. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence the more often and more steadily one reflects on them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. This quote captures something profound about Kant's vision of ethics. Just as the physical universe inspires awe with its vastness and order, the moral law, our capacity for recognizing and following duty, should inspire similar wonder. We are beings capable of acting from principle, of recognizing obligations that transcend our immediate interests, of respecting the dignity of ourselves and others. In cybersecurity, you work with incredibly complex technical systems, systems that can seem as vast and intricate as the starry heavens Kant describes. But you also work with systems that affect people, that involve trust and responsibility, that raise profound ethical questions. You navigate both the technical and the moral dimensions of your work. Kant's quote reminds us that the moral dimension deserves as much careful attention, as much wonder, as much ongoing reflection as the technical dimension. The moral law within you, your capacity for ethical reasoning and judgment, is as remarkable as any technical skill you'll develop. As we close this presentation, I encourage you to continue reflecting on these deontological principles, to test them against your experience, to refine your understanding of duty and rights and dignity. This kind of ethical reflection isn't a one-time exercise. It's an ongoing practice that will serve you throughout your career. If you have questions about this presentation or other aspects of the course, please feel free to email me or post a question in the Ask Your Instructor discussion forum in Canvas. I tend to respond to email much faster than to forum posts, but if you believe your question may be of interest to other students, then the Ask Your Instructor forum may be the more appropriate venue for your question. This has been Deontological Ethics, MPCR 5000, written and presented by Professor Scott D. Applegate, Georgetown University.